For today's video, we are going to be making a placket, and I would advise watching it towards the end before you follow along and try to make it your own. But here I am going to fold the fabric in half. The reason that is so that I can have a clear visual of what the center front is. If you chose to do your placket in the back, then just use a carbon paper and a tracing wheel in order to get that center front or center back line. Otherwise, your placket will be crooked. So I'm marking the sheet, the fabric, the muslin, just so that you are able to see it. The center front is marked with the marker, just so that you have a better visual. As far as your placket, make sure that the right side is facing down towards the wrong side of the center front of your main fabric. Line it up just so that everything is in alignment. The cut line in the middle of the pattern where that rectangle is exactly what should be lining up to your center front. Just make sure that it is nice and flush, otherwise you'll end up with a placket that is crooked, and I'm sure you don't want that. Secure your placket down with some pins, and from there you can use a marker or if you have a crayon, a pencil, whatever need be, just so that you can mark those anchor points, because from here you'll be sewing around that rectangle, pivoting around those corners, and coming back down to the center front neckline. Now that we've made it over to the sewing machine, just line up one of those edges. You're going to start from the very edge so that we could sew a part of that rectangle. Just keep it in alignment. You can follow the perforated lines that we made with the tracing wheel all the way down until you make it to the corner. Though I had made the two dots originally to show me my anchoring point, my pivoting point, somehow they disappeared. So I'll have to just mark it again with the marker just so that I have a better visual. Making sure that these points are in their right place is very important. Otherwise, it can throw your corners off, especially when it's time to clip and cut, and making sure that everything's in alignment so that we can flip this placket over and finalize it. So if need be, just use a marker and mark them again before you get to that point. Remember to sink your needle, lift up your presser foot, pivot and turn. Put down your presser foot again before you start sewing. Some machines won't allow you to sew with the presser foot being on, but this machine, since it's old school, like it'll just go if you push it down and your presser foot's not, down in its place. So please be careful and pivot around those corners. This part here requires a lot of manhandling, but the very first thing we're going to do is cut the middle of that rectangle that we made. We're going to cut it right to the tip of the V, and then from there we will make some angle clips just so that we can angle the cut lines right to the corner. And be careful so that you don't cut into your stitch, otherwise you'll have a hole. And the only way to fix it is to make a bigger placket with a bigger rectangle. But even with that, you'd have to adjust the sizing of the original placket that you have, and it's not fun. So just make sure you don't cut it. Just please be careful. From this point, it's mainly ironing. All of the tracing marks that we had added with the tracing wheel from the original pattern, we're just going to fold them into their right place. Once you're done, you can flip it over. Make sure you iron out the small corner so that everything falls into place, and it's going to be sandwiched between the placket and the body of the shirt or sleeve or whatever it may be. Just make sure that it's coming out on the same side. Like everything should be coming out on the same side, just like that. I went ahead and used my bevel driller just so that I can measure the distance of the edge of the fabric to make sure that my placket is actually centered. The tracing lines that I made originally disappeared. So I went ahead and I used the pattern along with the tracing wheel again, just so that I can get the small triangular tip at the edge, so that it's nice and even. Again, it's a lot of ironing. Majority of the things that you do with sewing, in order to get it nice and neat, you have to iron. So if you don't like it, then a lot of times your garment is not going to come out looking as good as it should, because ironing is your best friend when it comes to sewing. I promise we are almost done. We literally just have like 3 more steps and then we're done. But for this part here, though I ironed it and it was staying in place, I didn't want it to I didn't want to pin it, so I went ahead and I used this interfacing, which adheres on both sides. It comes into a strip. I believe usually people use it in hems, but me, I use it so that I don't have to use pins. Because this next part here, when you sew it down, you'll have to ditch stitch from the previous stitch where you added the perimeter. So using the double-sided interfacing, I can just sandwich it right there wherever it needs to be, just so that when I lay that seam allowance down, it's like a binding. Once I lay it down, I know for sure it'll stay in place, and when I go to ditch stitch, everything will fall in alignment as to where they should be. Yep, that's right, I'm cheating. Once you're done with the under placket, go ahead and move to the upper placket. The under placket is where you attach the buttons. This placket here at the top is where you make the actual buttonholes. Go ahead and clip it. Make sure you don't clip where you actually made your folded edge. So give yourself a seam allowance of about 1/4 of an inch. Fold it nice and neat. If need be, you can also add the interfacing, the one that's double-sided, just so that you can keep it in place. For this part here, you are going to ditch stitch. So make sure that the underlapping side is folded over at, you could say, make it past the seam by 1/8 of an inch. So on one side, it will look like it's an edge stitch. On the other side here, you're gonna ditch stitch. So this stitch on this side will look completely invisible once you're done. Now that you have stitched the placket for the under placket, you can go ahead and add your pins on the tip of the upper placket, just so that you can keep the triangular folds in place. And you can add them just like that, just so that they're nice and smooth. And what you're going to do is start from the very edge where the triangle is, and you're just going to sew that right on, like an edge stitch about 1/8 of an inch, and just sew that all the way down, just so that you have that fold creased and it stays in place. This will help you when it comes time to making your actual perimeter stitch around the upper placket. Make sure you clean off everything underneath. That way it's laying flat and nothing is fold underneath. Sometimes you think it's in the right place and it's actually folding under and it's not tucked where it needs to be. The edge of the placket should be sandwiched in between the upper placket along with the shell of the fabric itself. So what we're going to do is just pin it in place, iron it, that way it's nice and smooth. You can also add some interfacing in between, the interfacing in between, the one that's double-sided, just so that it'll stay in place and it's not going to shift on you. I like to use it. I believe this one is for the hem again, but depending where you go, like the store you go to, you might be able to find it with just a regular interface versus like the hem section or something. Add a little clip just so that you don't have a lot of bulk underneath the upper placket, and just continue to mold it over smooth out your triangular tips as smooth as possible. Since these are going to be in the center front, just try to make them as clean as possible because it will show. It will be right in the center, so it's definitely going to show if it's crooked or if it's off. Just maneuver it, flatten it. If you need to refold that triangle, definitely do so. And every now and then, double check in the back to make sure that everything is up to par. Add your pin here. The pin is just so that you can pinpoint exactly where it comes across, because you need to sew that piece down so that the seam allowance that is sandwiched in between the upper placket and the actual shell of the fabric doesn't come out. So that stitch is going to go right above that, and you can add 2 stitches going across just so that it'll keep it nice and clean. But as you can see, that stitch, the pin is right above that marking, and right here on the left hand side is where I have that ditch stitch, which is perfect in my knowledge. to my eyes anyway. To my eyes, that stitch is perfect. But obviously there's always room for improvement. So this is where you're going to make that perimeter stitch. You're going to start from the center front, go all the way down, go around those triangular tips, come back up and stitch across to where the pin is. And then you can backstitch, and that will wrap up your placket for today. So I realized in this last section here that I didn't record it all the way. My bobbin ran out of thread. So in the midst of me fixing it and putting it back online, it just never happened. I only got like the end portion of the recording. But here's an image of what it looked like in the end. The contrast stitch, it absolutely shows like any little error or movement that you do with the needle. If it's not in the right place, oh my goodness, it absolutely shows. So contrast stitching is not my favorite thing to do. The only reason I used it today is because I wanted you to see the line on where it would fall on the fabric. And not only that, my sewing machine, I think the tension might be off because some of the stitches, they look a little they're a bit loose. So it's something that I'll probably have to take to my the guy who usually fixes the machine just to take a look at it. But anyway, that's not really important right now. Now that we are done with the sample, what you can do is just take your little sample piece. You can create a binder for all your sample pieces just so that you keep them in store, you keep it in a safe place. I think when you are creating new garments, you can always go back to those samples just to make sure that you remember the process, you remember how to flow with it in order to, ensure that everything comes out smoothly. I am going to be creating a new sample book, so each week we will be making something new every Thursday. So if you have not subscribed to the channel, definitely do so. Like, comment, and share so that we can stay connected. Until then, I'll see you next time. To a place where we don't know about to see the world in action, what we can be. Life with no distractions, we'll get away. This is what we waited.